I stood in the parking lot of the VA office, still in my ACUs from the morning drill, when I tore open the letter that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. The envelope was from State University, and my hands were shaking as I read the words that made my blood run cold. Final notice. Your tuition payment of $6,800 is overdue. Unless payment is received within 3 business days, your enrollment will be terminated effective immediately. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at those words, reading them over and over again, certain there had to be some mistake. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the asphalt, but I felt ice cold. This couldn't be right. I had saved every penny of that money myself, working double shifts at the diner between National Guard weekends, picking up extra hours at the auto shop, even selling my grandmother's jewelry that she'd left me when she passed. $6,800. Sitting safely in the college savings account my mom had helped me open when I got back from my deployment to Afghanistan. Money that was supposed to be untouchable, sacred. My ticket to the mechanical engineering degree I'd dreamed about since I was 12 years old and first took apart our family's lawnmower. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I fumbled for my phone with trembling fingers, nearly dropping it twice before I managed to pull up my banking app. The screen seemed to blur as I waited for it to load, my mouth dry as dust. When the numbers finally appeared, I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. 0 balance. The account that should have contained my entire future showed absolutely nothing. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Maybe it was a glitch in the app, some technical error that would be resolved with a simple phone call to customer service. But as I scrolled through the transaction history, my stomach dropped into freefall. There they were, clear as day. Multiple large withdrawals over the past 2 weeks. A $2,000 withdrawal on March 3rd, another $1,500 on March 7th, $1,800 on March 12th, and finally the remaining $1,500 just 5 days ago, all of them authorized by the secondary account holder, my mother. My vision started to tunnel as I stared at the screen. Each transaction felt like a physical blow, and I could barely breathe. The dates aligned perfectly with when my mom had been acting strange, taking mysterious phone calls in the other room, whispering conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I walked in. I had attributed it to stress about her new marriage to Derek, the man she'd been dating for barely 8 months before they eloped in Vegas 3 weeks ago. I thought she was just nervous about blending our lives with his, about the awkwardness of a 42-year-old woman starting over with a man who had never been married and clearly resented having a stepdaughter who was only 6 years younger than him. The parking lot around me seemed to spin as the full weight of the betrayal hit me. This wasn't some accident or misunderstanding. My mother had systematically drained my college fund, the money I had earned through sweat and sacrifice, through 18-hour days and missed weekends with friends, through the PTSD nightmares that still woke me up screaming some nights. She had taken the future I had built dollar by dollar and spent it on God knows what for her new husband. I thought about all the times she had praised me for my responsibility, for my maturity, for being the daughter who never caused problems. "Madison, you're so much stronger than other kids your age," she used to say. "You've been through so much with the military. You understand sacrifice." I had worn those words like a badge of honor, never realizing they were actually a warning sign that I was being set up to sacrifice everything for everyone else's comfort. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone as I called the bank's customer service line. The representative confirmed what I already knew but desperately hoped wasn't true. Yes, the withdrawals were legitimate. Yes, they were authorized by the secondary account holder. No, there was nothing they could do about it now. The money was gone, legally taken by someone who had every right to access the account. Standing there in that blazing hot parking lot, still wearing the uniform I had put on with pride that morning, I felt something break inside me that I hadn't felt since the IED explosion that had ended my active duty career 2 years ago. It was the same sensation of sudden, complete helplessness, the same realization that everything you thought was solid and dependable could disappear in an instant. But this time, it wasn't enemy fire or roadside bombs that had destroyed my world. It was my own mother. The worst part wasn't even the money, devastating as that loss was. It was the casual betrayal, the fact that she had done this without even asking, without even acknowledging that she was stealing my future. She had made this decision in secret, probably discussing it with Derek in those whispered conversations, treating my life savings like it was some kind of family emergency fund that existed for their convenience. I sat down heavily on the concrete. Parking barrier, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. The college acceptance letter was still clutched in my other hand, now crumpled and damp with sweat. 3 days. I had 3 days to come up with nearly $7,000 or lose my spot in the program I had worked toward for 2 years. The mechanical engineering program at State University, the one that would let me use my GI Bill benefits most efficiently, the one that had specifically recruited veterans like me who had hands-on experience with military vehicles and equipment, all. Around me, life continued normally. Cars pulled in and out of the VA parking lot, other veterans going about their business, dealing with their own challenges and appointments. But for me, time had stopped. Everything I had planned, everything I had sacrificed for, was crumbling around me because the one person I had trusted most in the world had decided that her new marriage was more important than my education. As I sat there in the desert heat, holding the pieces of my shattered future, I realized that this moment would define everything that came next. I could let this betrayal destroy me, or I could find a way to rise above it. But first, I had to go home and confront the woman who had raised me, who had hugged me goodbye when I deployed to Afghanistan, who had cried tears of relief when I came home safely, and who had just stolen my future without a second thought. The drive home felt like an eternity, my beat-up Honda Civic struggling against the desert wind as I rehearsed what I would say to my mother. But nothing could have prepared me for the scene that greeted me when I walked through the front door of our small ranch house on Cactus Street. The living room looked like a furniture showroom had exploded. There was a massive leather sectional, where our old couch used to be, a 75-inch flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, and a glass coffee table that probably cost more than I made in 2 months at the auto shop. My mother was sitting on the new sofa, admiring what looked like a diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, while Derek lounged beside her with a beer in one hand and the remote in the other. He was wearing a brand new Cardinals jersey, and there were shopping bags from Best Buy, Macy's, and some high-end furniture stores scattered around the room like confetti from their spending spree. "Madison!" my mother called out cheerfully when she saw me standing in the doorway. "Perfect timing. Come see what Derek surprised me with for our 1-month anniversary. Isn't it gorgeous?" She held up her wrist, the bracelet catching the light from their ridiculously oversized new television. I felt my throat close up as I stared at her. This woman who had raised me alone for most of my life, who had taught me the value of hard work and saving money, who was now showing off jewelry that had probably cost more than my entire semester's tuition. The betrayal hit me like a physical force, and for a moment I couldn't find my voice. "Where did you get the money for all this?" I managed to ask, though we both knew the answer. My mother's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly, waving her hand dismissively as if I was asking about something trivial. "Oh, honey, we used your college savings. Derek really needed to furnish the house properly now that we're married, and I thought you'd understand. You're always so mature about these things." The casual way she said it, like she was telling me she'd borrowed my car or eaten my leftovers, made my vision blur with rage. "You used my college savings?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Derek chose that moment to chime in, not even bothering to look away from the enormous TV screen. "Yeah, thanks for that, Madison. Your mom told me how responsible you are with money. We really needed to make this place feel like home, you know? Marriage is about building a life together. He gestured around the room with his beer bottle like he was some kind of interior design expert instead of a 48-year-old man who had never lived anywhere fancier than a bachelor apartment above a strip mall. My mother nodded eagerly, as if Derek had just said something profound. Exactly. Derek's never been married before, and I want him to feel comfortable here. You understand sacrifice, sweetie. You've been in the military. You know what it means to put the needs of others first. I stared at her in complete disbelief. She was actually trying to frame this theft as some kind of patriotic duty, as if my military service had somehow obligated me to fund her new husband's shopping addiction. Mom, that was $6,800? My entire college fund. I worked for 2 years to save that money. And we appreciate it so much, she said, reaching over to pat Derek's arm affectionately. Derek says once he gets his business idea off the ground, he'll pay. You back with interest, right, honey? Derek made a non-committal grunt without taking his eyes off the TV, where some sports commentator was analyzing yesterday's game on his new entertainment system. Sure, babe. Whatever you said. The business idea. I had heard whispers about Derek's grand entrepreneurial plans during their brief courtship. Something about starting a food truck that would serve gourmet hot dogs with international flair. The kind of half-baked scheme that middle-aged men with no business experience always seem to think would make them millionaires overnight. I need that money back, Mom. Now. I have 3 days to pay my tuition, or I lose my spot in the program. My voice was getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. She looked genuinely surprised by my reaction, as if she couldn't understand why I was being so unreasonable. Madison, don't be so dramatic. You're only 24. You have plenty of time to go to college later. Derek and I are building something here, something permanent. This is about family. I am family. The words erupted out of me with more force than I intended. I'm your daughter. I've been your family for 24 years, long before Derek showed up with his brilliant hot dog business plan. Derek finally looked up from the TV, his face twisted with annoyance. Hey, watch your tone when you're talking about my wife, kid. Show some respect. The word kid hit me like a slap. Here was a man who had contributed nothing to this household, who had moved in with his gaming console and his collection of vintage beer signs, calling me a kid while sitting on furniture, bought with money I had earned through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights working multiple jobs. Respect? I laughed bitterly. You want to talk about respect? How about respecting the fact that I served my country while you were playing video games in your apartment? How about respecting the fact that I've been working since I was 16? To save for my education? How about respecting the fact that this is my house too and you just moved in here like you own the place? My mother stood up abruptly, her face flushing red. Madison Elizabeth Carter, that is enough. Derek is my husband now, which makes him part of this family whether you like it or not. I will not have you disrespecting him in our home. Our home. She said it like Derek had been paying the mortgage for years instead of weeks. Like he had been there for the nights when I came home from Afghanistan with nightmares, or when I struggled through physical therapy for my leg injury, or when I worked overtime to help with the bills during her unemployment stint last year. You stole from me, I said quietly, the fight suddenly draining out of me as the full reality of the situation settled in. You took my future and spent it on a TV and a bracelet and furniture for a man you barely know. She tilted her head slightly, studying me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve. I didn't steal anything, honey. That money was in a family account. Derek and I are starting our new life together, and sometimes that requires investment. You'll thank me later when you see how happy we are. Derek nodded sagely, as if my mother had just delivered some kind of profound wisdom instead of the most ridiculous justification for theft I had ever heard. Your mom's right, Madison. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money. Once my food truck takes off, we'll be able to help you out way more than that college fund ever could have. I stood there looking at them, really looking at them, and realized that they genuinely believed what they were saying. In their minds, they hadn't stolen from me. They had made a wise investment in their future, and I should be grateful to be part of their grand plan. The fact that it was my money, my sacrifice, my future that they had gambled on Derek's culinary dreams was just a minor detail. That's when I knew that arguing was pointless. They had already decided that Derek's comfort was more important than my education, that their new marriage took precedence over the daughter who had been there all along. No amount of pleading or reasoning was going to change their minds or bring back my money. Standing in that living room, surrounded by the evidence of their spending spree, I felt a familiar numbness creeping over me. The same emotional shutdown I had experienced during my worst days in Afghanistan. It was a protective mechanism my mind had developed to cope with situations where the betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that processing it in real time would have broken me entirely. But as I looked at my mother and Derek lounging on their new furniture, acting like nothing had happened, memories began flooding back with crystal clarity. This wasn't the first time my mother had chosen someone else over me. It was just the most expensive. I remembered being 8 years old when she started dating Marcus, the mechanic who promised to fix our constantly breaking down car. For 6 months, every dollar that should have gone toward my school supplies or decent clothes went to Marcus instead. Gas money, beer money, money for his tools that he claimed would help him start his own garage. I wore the same pair of sneakers until they literally fell apart, held together with duct tape and hope, while Marcus got brand new work boots and a leather jacket. When he finally disappeared with our car and $300 from my mom's purse, she cried for weeks about how she couldn't trust anyone anymore. But she never apologized for making me eat peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so Marcus could eat steak. Then there was David when I was 13, the aspiring musician who was going to make it big with his metal band. My mother convinced herself she was supporting an artist, and for almost a year, my babysitting money mysteriously disappeared from my dresser drawer whenever David needed new guitar strings or recording studio time. I had been saving to buy my first computer for school, putting aside $5 here and $10 there from watching the neighbors' kids. When I finally confronted her about the missing money, she told me that David's music career was an investment in our future, that when he made it big, we'd all benefit. David's band never made it past playing in dive bars, and he left town owing us $2,000 in rent money. When I was 16 and working at the movie theater, she started seeing Robert, the construction worker who was supposedly starting his own contracting business. My college fund, the original one I had started with my first job, became seed money for Robert's company. He needed a truck, he said. He needed tools and equipment. He needed capital to bid on jobs. My mother handed over every penny I had saved, convinced that Robert was finally the man who would make our lives stable. Robert's construction business turned out to be Robert sitting in our living room, drinking beer and talking about all the jobs he was going to bid on someday. He never did any actual work, never brought in a single dollar, and when my mother finally asked him to leave, my college fund had been transformed into a rusty pickup truck that he drove away in. Each time, the pattern was the same. My mother would meet a man who filled her head with dreams of financial stability and partnership. She would convince herself that investing in his schemes was investing in our family's future. And each time it was my money, my savings, my sacrifice, my future, that funded these fantasies. When things inevitably fell apart, she would promise that the next time would be different, that she had learned her lesson, that she would never again let a man come between her and her daughter's well-being. But here we were again, and this time the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. This wasn't babysitting money or savings from a part-time job at the movie theater. This was $6,800 that I had earned through some of the hardest work of my life. Money saved during my deployment to Afghanistan, where I lived in a tent for 8 months and sent every possible penny home. Money earned working overnight shifts at the diner, serving coffee to drunk college students and cleaning up their messes while my fellow veterans slept in warm beds. Money made by crawling under cars in the scorching Arizona heat, my hands black with grease, my back aching from hours bent over engines. I thought about the night I had worked a double shift at the diner, then driven straight to my National Guard drill weekend, surviving on energy drinks and determination because I couldn't afford to miss either commitment. I remembered the weeks when I ate nothing but ramen noodles and peanut butter because every extra dollar went into that savings account. I thought about the times I had declined invitations to hang out with friends because I couldn't afford movies or restaurants, choosing instead to stay home and study or work extra hours. My mother used to brag about my dedication to other people. "Madison is so focused," she would tell her friends at church. "She never asks for anything, never complains about working so hard. She's going to make something of herself." I had believed that her pride in my work ethic meant she understood the value of what I was building, that she respected the sacrifices I was making for my future. But now I realized that all along, she had just been fattening me up for slaughter. My reliability, my responsibility, my willingness to work harder than anyone else my age, these weren't qualities she admired. They were resources she could exploit when the right man came along with the right sob story about needing investment capital. Standing there, watching Derek flip through channels on his 75-inch television while my mother admired her diamond bracelet. I felt something shift inside me that went deeper than anger or disappointment. It was a bone-deep recognition that I had been fundamentally wrong about who these people were and what I meant to them. For 24 years, I had believed that my mother and I were a team, that we looked out for each other, that family meant something sacred and unbreakable. But the truth was much simpler and much more painful. To my mother, I had never been a daughter. I had been a bank account with legs, a resource to be tapped whenever her latest romantic interest needed funding. Every hug, every word of encouragement, every moment of pride she had shown in my accomplishments, it had all been an investment, strategy, a way to keep me motivated to earn more money that she could eventually redirect toward whatever man happened to be warming her bed. Derek represented the culmination of this pattern, but he was also different from the others in one crucial way. Marcus had been genuinely broke. David had been delusionally optimistic about his musical talents, and Robert had been lazy, but not intentionally malicious. Derek, however, was something else entirely. From the moment I met him, I could see the calculation in his eyes, the way he assessed everything in our house like he was taking inventory. He had targeted my mother specifically because she was vulnerable, because she was desperate to prove that she could attract and keep a man, and because she had a daughter who worked multiple jobs and had savings. This hadn't been an accidental betrayal or a moment of poor judgment. This had been a deliberate, systematic theft orchestrated by a man who specialized in finding middle-aged women with assets and adult children who could be manipulated into funding his lifestyle. My mother hadn't just fallen for another loser. She had fallen for a professional predator who had identified her as an easy mark from day one. The worst part was that she couldn't see it, or didn't want to see it. Even now, as Derek ignored her attempts at conversation and focused on his television programming, she looked at him with the same starry-eyed devotion that had characterized all her previous relationships. She had traded her daughter's future for a few months of feeling desired by a man who was already mentally planning his next move. In that moment, watching them enjoy the fruits of my labor while treating my devastation as an inconvenience, I understood that this was never going to stop. As long as I remained in this house, as long as I continued to work and save and build a future, there would always be another Derek waiting to steal it. My mother had shown me exactly who she was and what she valued, and I finally had the wisdom to believe her. The silence in the living room stretched on as Derek continued channel surfing, and my mother examined her new bracelet, both of them acting like the conversation was over, like my concerns had been addressed and dismissed. But inside my chest, something was crystallizing that had been building for years without me fully recognizing it. It wasn't rage, though fury was certainly part of it. It wasn't even heartbreak, though my heart felt like it had been put through a wood chipper. It was something quieter and more dangerous. Absolute clarity. I wasn't angry anymore because anger implied that I still had expectations, that I still believed these people might change or apologize or recognize what they had done. But sitting there watching Derek scroll through premium cable channels that my college fund had paid for while my mother admired jewelry bought with my deployment savings, I felt those expectations die a quiet, final death. The emotional investment I had been making in this family for 24 years had just been revealed as a complete loss, and it was time to cut my losses and walk away. The revelation didn't come with fireworks or dramatic music. It arrived like dawn breaking over the desert, slowly, then all at once, bringing harsh light to a landscape I had been navigating in darkness for years. I had been exhausted for so long, carrying the weight of being the responsible one, the reliable one, the daughter who never needed anything and always gave everything. I had worn that role like a uniform, proud of my ability to sacrifice and endure and keep moving forward no matter what obstacles were thrown in my path. But exhaustion, I realized, wasn't a virtue. It was a symptom. I had been so busy being strong that I had never stopped to ask myself why I needed to be strong all the time, why I was the only one in this family who was expected to sacrifice her dreams for everyone else's comfort. I had been so focused on proving my worth through service and sacrifice that I had never demanded to be valued simply for existing, simply for being their daughter and deserving their protection rather than their exploitation. The military had taught me about duty and honor and putting the mission before personal comfort, but it had also taught me about loyalty and having your battle buddies watch your back. In the Army, we had a saying, "Leave no one behind." But my own family had left me behind years ago. They had just been subtle enough about it that I hadn't noticed. They had convinced me that being left behind was actually leadership, that carrying everyone else's burden was strength rather than enabling. Looking at my mother now, I could see her clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. She wasn't a victim of circumstance or bad luck in love. She was a woman who had made the conscious choice, again and again, to prioritize her romantic relationships over her daughter's well-being. She had raised me to be independent and self-sufficient, not because she wanted me to succeed, but because she wanted to be free to chase men without the inconvenience of actual parenting responsibilities. Every lesson she had taught me about hard work and responsibility had been designed to create a daughter who would never be a burden, who would always contribute more than she took, who would fund the family's stability while expecting nothing in return. She had trained me to be the perfect mark for her financial schemes, teaching me to work multiple jobs and save every penny while simultaneously teaching me that questioning the family's financial decisions was selfish and disrespectful. Derek, meanwhile, represented everything I had been trained to accept in the men my mother chose. He was selfish, entitled, and completely comfortable living off the labor of women while contributing nothing meaningful to their lives. He had moved into our house like a conquering king, rearranging our space to suit his preferences, spending our money on his desires, and treating me like an inconvenient roommate rather than the daughter of the woman he claimed to love. But what struck me most profoundly was how natural this all felt to them, how easily they had slipped into this dynamic where I worked, and they benefited. There was no guilt in their voices, no acknowledgement that anything unusual or unfair was happening. To them, this was simply the natural order of things. Madison works, Madison saves, Madison sacrifices, and everyone else enjoys the results. Chiu. Pattern was so entrenched that they couldn't even see it as a pattern. In their minds, each incident had been an isolated situation that required my contribution for the greater good of the family. Marcus had needed help getting back on his feet. David had been pursuing his artistic dreams. Robert had been starting a business that would benefit all of us. And now Derek was building a foundation for his marriage to my mother, which obviously took precedence over my selfish desire for education. They had never asked themselves why. It was always my money that funded these ventures, why I was always the one expected to delay my dreams for someone else's immediate gratification. They had never questioned why a 24-year-old veteran should be financially responsible for supporting her mother's lifestyle choices, or why a daughter's college fund should be considered available capital for her stepfather's entertainment system. The most devastating realization was that they genuinely believed they deserved this. They weren't stealing from me. They were collecting what was rightfully theirs. My mother had invested 24 years in raising me, and now it was time for that investment to pay dividends. Derek had married into the family, which entitled him to family resources. My savings account wasn't really mine. It was a family asset that could be redistributed based on need. And clearly they needed a new sofa, more than I needed an education. This sense of entitlement was what made the situation truly hopeless. I couldn't reason with people who fundamentally believed that my labor existed for their benefit, that my dreams were less important than their immediate comfort, that my military service had somehow created an obligation for me to fund their civilian lifestyle indefinitely. Sitting there in the living room that now looked like a furniture store showroom, I felt the last threads of attachment to this family finally snap. It wasn't a dramatic break accompanied by shouting or tears. It was more like finally letting go of a rope I had been clinging to for so long that my hands were bloody and cramped, only to realize that the rope wasn't actually attached to anything solid on the other end. For years, I had been holding on to the belief that somewhere underneath my mother's poor choices and pattern of toxic relationships was the woman who had raised me, who had been proud of my accomplishments, who loved me enough to put my needs first when it really mattered. But that woman had never existed. The mother I remembered from childhood had been playing a long game, teaching me to be self-sufficient so she wouldn't have to sacrifice anything for my well-being, training me to work hard so there would be more money available for her to redirect toward her romantic interests. The grief I felt wasn't for the loss of my college fund, devastating as that was. It was for the loss of my family, for the recognition that the people I had loved and served and sacrificed for had never really existed. I had been in love with an illusion, a fantasy version of family where loyalty and sacrifice worked both ways, where my contributions were valued rather than simply expected. But grief, I had learned in Afghanistan, was a luxury you couldn't afford when you were still in hostile territory. You processed the loss later, when you were safe. Right now, I needed to focus on extraction. I needed to get out of this situation with as much of my dignity and future intact as possible, and I needed to do it without warning them that I was planning my escape. The woman who had walked into this house 20 minutes ago would have continued, arguing, would have tried to make them understand the magnitude of what they had done, would have appealed to their sense of fairness and family loyalty. But that woman had died somewhere between Derek's casual dismissal and my mother's casual justification. The woman sitting here now understood that some betrayals were too complete to forgive, some damage too systematic to repair. It was time to stop being their daughter and start being my own person. I stood up from the couch slowly, feeling like I was moving through water, every muscle in my body heavy with the weight of what I now understood about my life. Derek didn't even glance up from his channel surfing as I walked past him, and my mother was still admiring her bracelet, tilting her wrist this way and that to catch the light from their massive new television. The normalcy of their behavior felt surreal, like I was watching actors playing roles in a play about domestic dysfunction, rather than witnessing my actual family destroying my future with casual indifference. "I need to make some phone calls," I said quietly, testing my voice to make sure it came out steady. "Work stuff." My mother nodded absently, not really listening. "Okay, sweetie. Derek and I are going to order Chinese food later if you want some. From that expensive place downtown, the one with the lobster-fried rice. Derek says we should celebrate our new furniture properly." The irony of her offering to buy me dinner with what remained of my money wasn't lost on me, but I just nodded and headed toward my bedroom. As I walked down the hallway, I could hear Derek telling my mother about some sports package he wanted to add to their cable subscription, and her enthusiastic agreement that they deserved to enjoy themselves after all the stress of the wedding. Once, inside my room, I closed the door with deliberate care, turning the lock with a soft click that sounded like the most decisive action I had taken in years. The space around me looked exactly the same as it had this morning when I left for National Guard drill, but everything felt different now. The twin bed I had slept in since middle school, the desk where I had done homework and filled out college applications, the dresser topped with pictures of my military unit and certificates from various training programs. It all looked like artifacts from someone else's life. I sat down on the edge of my bed and pulled out my phone, staring at the screen for a long moment before I began the methodical process of taking back control of my life. The first call was to my bank, where I spent 45 minutes navigating automated systems and explaining my situation to 3 different representatives before finally reaching someone who could help me understand my options. The news wasn't good, but it wasn't entirely hopeless either. Yes, the withdrawals had been legal since my mother was a joint account holder. No, there was no way to reverse the transactions or force her to return the money. However, I could remove her access immediately and change all the security information on any remaining accounts. I could also file a complaint with the bank's fraud department, though they made it clear that family disputes over joint accounts rarely resulted in any meaningful action. As I waited on hold during various transfers, I opened my laptop and began making a list of everything I needed to do. Years of military planning had taught me the value of breaking overwhelming situations down into manageable tasks, and this felt like the most important mission briefing of my life. At the top of the page, I wrote Operation Independence in bold letters, then began outlining the steps I would need to take to extract myself from this toxic situation. The second call was to my credit card company, where I discovered that my mother had also attempted to use my credit card for additional purchases that had been declined due to insufficient credit limit. The customer service representative helped me change all my passwords and security questions, and we agreed to issue me a new card with a different number. I also learned that I could place a fraud alert on my credit report to prevent anyone from opening new accounts in my name without my explicit permission. While I was on hold during that call, I opened a new browser window and started researching apartments for rent near campus. The prices were sobering. Even a studio apartment would eat up most of my income from the auto shop and my National Guard pay. But as I scrolled through listings, I felt something I hadn't experienced in hours. Hope. These tiny, overpriced apartments represented freedom, a place where no one could steal from me while I slept, where I could build something that belonged entirely to me. The third call was the most difficult one. I dialed the number for State University's financial aid office, my hands shaking as I waited for someone to answer. When I finally reached a counselor, I explained my situation as calmly as I could manage, though my voice cracked when I got to the part about discovering the theft. The counselor was sympathetic but firm about the deadline. I had 3 days to pay the tuition or my enrollment would be terminated. However, she also gave me information I hadn't known existed. There were emergency financial aid grants available for students facing unexpected hardships, including family financial abuse. The application process was complex and there were no guarantees, but if I could document what had happened and demonstrate financial need, there might be options available. She also mentioned that my veteran status made me eligible for certain programs that could help bridge the gap between my GI Bill benefits and the immediate tuition requirement. As I took notes during that conversation, I felt the first spark of the determination that had carried me through basic training, through deployment, through the long nights of physical therapy after my injury. This wasn't over. My mother and Derek had won this battle, but the war for my future was far from decided. The fourth call was to my supervisor at the auto shop, a gruff but fair man named Eddie who had hired me despite my lack of formal automotive training because he respected my military background. I explained that I needed to pick up extra shifts, as many as he could give me, and asked if he knew of any other shops in town that might need part-time help. Eddie was quiet for a long moment before telling me that his brother-in-law ran a towing company that needed someone to work nights and weekends, and that the pay was better than what most college students could find. Between calls, I began the physical process of preparing for my extraction. I pulled my old military duffel bag from the closet, the same one I had used during deployment, and began carefully selecting what to take with me. Every decision felt weighted with significance. These items would represent everything I owned in my new life, everything I could carry away from this family that had betrayed me so completely. I packed my military uniforms first, both my dress blues and my ACUs, folding them with the same precision I had learned in basic training. These represented not just clothing, but proof of who I was beyond this family's definition of me. I was a veteran, a soldier who had served her country with honor, and that identity existed independently of whether my mother valued it or not. Next came my important documents: birth certificate, social security card, military discharge papers, college, acceptance letters, bank statements that would serve as evidence of the theft if I needed it later. I sealed these in a waterproof folder that I had used to protect paperwork during deployment, treating them like the precious cargo they were. My laptop and the few textbooks I had already purchased for the coming semester went into the bag next, along with my uniforms and my personal equipment from my time in service. I packed enough clothes for a week, choosing practical items that could be mixed and matched, avoiding anything that held sentimental value that might make me hesitate about leaving. The hardest items to pack were the photos, pictures of my military unit, images from my deployment, snapshots of my mother and me from happier times when I still believed she had my best interests at heart. In the end, I took only the military photos, leaving behind the family pictures that now felt like evidence of my own naivety rather than treasured memories. As I worked, I could hear my mother and Derek in the living room, their voices carrying down the hallway as they discussed dinner plans and debated which premium channel package would give them the best value. The casual normalcy of their conversation, their complete lack of concern about the devastation they had caused, reinforced my certainty that leaving was the right choice. By the time I finished packing, the sun was setting outside my bedroom window, painting the walls with orange light that made everything look like it was already part of the past. I sat back on my bed, looking at the duffel bag that contained my entire future, and felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The house felt different as I carried my duffel bag down the hallway, like I was moving through a museum exhibit of someone else's life rather than the place I had called home for the past 6 years. Every step was deliberate and quiet, my military training kicking in automatically as I moved through what was now essentially enemy territory. The floorboards that I knew creaked near the bathroom, the loose carpet edge by the linen closet. I avoided them all with the same careful precision I had once used moving through potentially hostile villages in Afghanistan. From the living room came the sound of Derek's booming laugh at something on their new television, followed by my mother's delighted giggle. They were watching some comedy, special, completely absorbed in their entertainment, blissfully unaware that their primary source of funding was about to walk out of their lives forever. The Chinese food containers from their expensive dinner were scattered across their new glass coffee table, evidence of yet another purchase made possible by my stolen savings. I paused at the front door, my hand on the handle, and took one last look back toward the living room where they sat together on their leather sectional. For a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been nostalgia or regret, but it passed quickly. These people had made their choice about what mattered to them, and it wasn't me. Now I was making my choice, and it wasn't them. The cool desert air hit my face as I stepped outside, and I took my first breath as a truly independent person. The sensation was strange, part terrifying, part exhilarating, like jumping out of an airplane and realizing that your parachute might actually work. I had nowhere to go, less than $200 in my checking account, and no guarantee that any of my desperate plans would work out. But for the first time in years, possibly ever, I was breathing air that belonged entirely to me. I had called my old Army buddy Jessica Martinez earlier, reaching out to someone from my unit who had moved to Phoenix after her discharge. We had served together in Afghanistan, and she was one of the few people who understood both the military mindset and the complexities of transitioning back to civilian life with family who didn't quite know what to do with a female veteran. When I explained my situation, she had immediately offered me her couch for as long as I needed it. No questions asked, no expectations of repayment. The drive to Jessica's apartment took me through the part of Phoenix I knew well from my National Guard duties, past the recruiting station where I had first signed up at 17, past the community college where I had taken my first engineering prerequisites. Everything looked the same, but I felt like I was seeing it all through different eyes now. These weren't just familiar landmarks. They were waypoints on a journey toward a future that I would build entirely on my own terms. Jessica lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a complex that primarily housed other veterans and community college students. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and safe, and when she opened the door to greet me, her familiar face felt like the first genuinely warm welcome I had received in months. She was still the same tough, no-nonsense woman I had served with, but civilian life had softened some of her edges. She worked as a dispatcher for the Phoenix Fire Department and was taking night classes in emergency management, building a career that utilized her military experience while preparing for a stable future. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Madison, you look like hell, she said without preamble, taking my duffel bag and ushering me inside. When was the last time you ate something that wasn't from a vending machine? Her apartment was small but efficiently organized, with military precision evident in everything from the perfectly made bed visible through her bedroom doorway to the way her textbooks were arranged on the coffee table. The living room had a comfortable couch, a modest television, and walls decorated with photos from our deployment and certificates from various training programs. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where my military service was valued rather than exploited. I grabbed some Thai food on the way home, Jessica continued, leading me to the kitchen where containers of pad Thai and green curry were waiting. I figured you probably weren't up for cooking tonight. Want to tell me what happened, or do you need to decompress first? Over dinner, I found myself telling the whole story, starting with finding the tuition notice and ending with my careful departure from my mother's house. Jessica listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding, but mostly just letting me talk through the situation that had completely upended my life in the span of a single afternoon. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, stirring her curry thoughtfully. "You know what this reminds me of?" she finally said. "Remember Corporal Williams, the one whose wife cleaned out their joint account while he was deployed? Same pattern. Family member with access, complete betrayal of trust. Victim left holding the bag because technically it was all legal." I did remember Williams, a quiet man from Ohio, whose wife had emptied their savings to fund what she claimed was a legitimate business opportunity with her brother. By the time Williams came home, the money was gone, the business had never existed, and his wife was living with the brother in a house purchased with Williams's deployment pay. The parallel was uncomfortable, but accurate. "The difference," Jessica continued, "is that Williams had the Army to fall back on, a guaranteed paycheck and housing until he could figure things out. You're dealing with this as a civilian, which makes it both harder and easier. Harder because you don't have the same safety net, but easier because you have more control over your response." She was right. In the military, there would have been paperwork and procedures, official channels for addressing financial abuse by family members. As a civilian, I had fewer resources but more freedom to make immediate changes without seeking permission from a chain of command that might not understand the urgency of my situation. "What's your plan?" Jessica asked, clearing away our empty containers with characteristic efficiency. I pulled out the notebook where I had been writing down my options during the drive over. First priority is the tuition deadline. I've got an appointment with financial aid tomorrow morning to see if there are any emergency grants available. If that doesn't work, I'm going to try to negotiate a payment plan, maybe defer enrollment for a semester while I rebuild my savings. Jessica nodded approvingly. Smart. Don't let pride keep you from exploring every option. What about work? I'm picking up extra shifts at the auto shop, and Eddie connected me with his brother-in-law who runs a towing company. Night and weekend work, better pay than retail. If I can handle both jobs plus my National Guard duties, I might be able to make the numbers work. And housing? That's the big question mark. I can't afford anything near campus on my current income, but I found a few places further out that might be doable if I can line up the towing job. Worst case scenario, I commute from wherever I can afford to live and deal with the extra gas. Costs. Jessica was quiet for a moment, then got up and walked to her bedroom, returning with a manila folder that she set on the coffee table between us. I've been thinking about getting a roommate anyway, she said casually. This place has 2 bedrooms, and my rent would be a lot more manageable if it was split between 2 people. You interested in a trial run while you get back on your feet? The offer hit me like an unexpected gift, and I felt my eyes start to water before I could stop them. Jessica, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. We served together, Madison. We've got each other's backs. That doesn't stop just because we're civilians now. For the first time since I had opened that tuition notice 12 hours ago, I felt like maybe everything was going to be okay. Not easy, not simple, but okay. I had a place to stay with someone who understood me, a plan for addressing my immediate financial crisis, and most importantly, I had taken the first step toward building a life that belonged entirely to me. We worked out the details of our potential roommate arrangement. I realized that this was what family was supposed to feel like. Not the conditional love and constant exploitation I had experienced with my mother, but genuine care and mutual support between people who respected each other's autonomy and contributions. For the first time in years, I fell asleep knowing that no one could steal from me while I was unconscious, that I was safe and valued exactly as I was. The next morning came earlier than I would have liked, but I had learned in the military that some battles required you to be fully engaged from the moment you opened your eyes. I woke up on Jessica's couch at 5:30 a.m., my internal clock still programmed for early National Guard formations, and lay there for a few minutes listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her apartment complex coming to life around me. Water. Running through pipes, car doors slamming in the parking lot, the distant hum of morning traffic on the highway. All of it felt like the soundtrack to possibility, rather than the oppressive silence I had grown accustomed to at my mother's house. Jessica was already up and moving around her kitchen when I emerged from the living room, dressed in her fire department uniform and making coffee with the same efficiency she had once used to break down and clean her service weapon. She looked up when she heard me stirring and nodded toward a clean mug sitting next to the coffee maker. I've got to be at work in 30 minutes, she said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs and handing me one. But I did some research last night after you fell asleep. Called a friend who works in the financial aid office at Arizona State. She gave me some intel that might help with your appointment this morning. I took the coffee gratefully, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic and inhaling the rich aroma. It was good coffee, much better than the instant stuff my mother had always bought. And somehow that small luxury felt like evidence that my life might actually improve now that I was in control of it. Apparently, there's a specific emergency grant program for military families experiencing financial hardship, Jessica continued, leaning against her kitchen counter and consulting notes she had written on the back of an envelope. It's not widely advertised because they don't want to be overwhelmed with applications, but it's designed exactly for situations like yours. The catch is that you have to have documentation proving that the financial crisis was caused by circumstances beyond your control. I felt a flicker of hope mixed with frustration. I have bank statements showing the unauthorized withdrawals, but since my mother was technically authorized to access the account, I don't know if that counts as beyond my control. That's where it gets interesting, Jessica said, checking her watch and moving toward her bedroom to gather her gear for work. According to my friend, family financial abuse is specifically recognized under this program. The fact that you're a veteran who was serving your country while saving for education, and that a family member stole your savings for non-essential purchases, actually makes you an ideal candidate. She emerged from her bedroom with her equipment, bag and keys, pausing long enough to write down a name and phone number on a sticky note. Ask to speak with Counselor Patricia Williams when you get there. My friend says she's the one who really understands the military family dynamics and has the authority to approve emergency funds without going through the usual committee process. After Jessica left for work, I spent the next hour preparing for what felt like the most important job interview of my life. I showered and dressed in my best civilian clothes, a pair of dark jeans and a button-down shirt that I hoped struck the right balance between respectful and approachable. I gathered all my documentation, bank statements, college acceptance letters, military discharge papers, pay stubs from my various jobs, and a letter I had written the night before explaining my situation in detail. The financial aid office at State University was busier than I had expected for 8 in the morning, filled with students and parents dealing with various crises and complications. I took a number and sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, watching other people navigate their own financial emergencies while I rehearsed what I would say to Counselor Williams. When my number was finally called, I found myself sitting across from a woman in her 50s who looked like she had seen every possible variation of student financial crisis during her career. Patricia Williams had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, but there was also a no-nonsense quality to her demeanor that reminded me of some of my favorite NCOs from the Army. "Madison Carter," she said, consulting my file on her computer screen. "Jessica Martinez called me last night and gave me some background on your situation. I understand you're dealing with some family financial complications that have put your enrollment at risk." I had planned to start with a calm, professional explanation of my circumstances, but something about Counselor Williams' direct approach made me abandon my rehearsed speech in favor of simply telling the truth. I laid out the entire situation, from discovering the unauthorized withdrawals to my mother's casual justification to Derek's entitled attitude about spending my money on their new lifestyle. Counselor Williams listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly just focusing on my words with the kind of attention that made me feel like she was truly hearing what I was telling her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, reviewing the bank statements and documentation I had provided. "Ms. Carter," she said finally, "what you're describing is a textbook case of financial abuse by family members. Unfortunately, it's more common than people realize, especially among young adults who have demonstrated financial responsibility. Predatory family members often target the most reliable person in the household, knowing they can exploit that person's sense of duty and loyalty." She turned to her computer and began typing, pulling up screens that I couldn't see from my angle. "The good news is that we have several programs designed specifically to help students in your situation. The emergency hardship grant that Jessica mentioned is one option, but given your military service and the specific nature of this financial abuse, I think we can do better than that." For the next 20 minutes, Counselor Williams walked me through a series of programs and options that I hadn't even known existed. There was indeed an emergency grant available that could cover my immediate tuition shortfall, but she also identified additional funding sources that could help with housing and living expenses. My veteran status made me eligible for several scholarships that were specifically reserved for military women transitioning to higher education. "Here's what I'm prepared to offer you today," she said, printing out several forms and sliding them across her desk. "A full emergency hardship grant to cover this semester's tuition, plus enrollment in our Veteran Success Program, which includes mentoring, tutoring support, and priority registration for classes. Additionally, I'm going to recommend you for..." the Sarah Morrison Scholarship, which provides funding for female veterans pursuing engineering degrees. I stared at the paperwork, hardly believing what I was hearing. How much would the scholarship cover? If approved, it would pay for your remaining tuition, plus a monthly stipend for living expenses. The application process usually takes several months, but given your circumstances and your academic record, I'm going to expedite the review. You should hear back within 2 weeks. As I signed the various forms and applications, I felt something loosening in my chest that I hadn't even realized was there. For the first time since opening that tuition notice yesterday, I could imagine a future where I actually completed my engineering degree, where I built the career I had been working toward for years. One more thing, Counselor Williams said as I gathered up my copies of the paperwork. I want you to know that what your family did to you was not only morally wrong, it was potentially illegal. Financial abuse is a serious crime, and if you decide to pursue legal action, the university has resources that can help connect you with appropriate legal services. The drive back to Jessica's apartment gave me time to process what had just happened. In the span of 90 minutes, I had gone from facing academic disaster to having a clear path forward that didn't require me to depend on anyone who might betray my trust. The emergency grant meant I could register for classes and continue my education without interruption. The scholarship opportunity meant I might actually be able to complete my degree without accumulating crushing debt. More importantly, I had been reminded that there were people in the world who valued education, who respected military service, who understood that stealing someone's future was a serious crime rather than a casual family financial transaction. Counselor Williams had treated my situation with the gravity it deserved, and her matter-of-fact approach to addressing the abuse had helped me realize that I wasn't overreacting or being dramatic about my mother's betrayal. When I walked into Jessica's apartment that afternoon, I felt like a different person than the one who had fled my mother's house less than 24 hours earlier. I had a plan, resources, and most importantly, proof that I could take care of myself without enabling my family's dysfunction. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both exhausting and exhilarating, like the most challenging training, exercise I had ever undertaken. Every day began at 5 a.m. with coffee and a review of my increasingly complex schedule, color-coded in a notebook that Jessica had given me to track my various commitments. Blue for classes, red for work at the auto shop, green for my new towing company shifts, and yellow for National Guard duties that I couldn't afford to miss if I wanted to maintain my veteran benefits. The emergency grant had come through exactly, as Counselor Williams had promised, allowing me to register for my full course load just 2 days before the semester started. Walking into my first engineering class felt like a victory lap, even though I was running on 4 hours of sleep and my hands were still stained with motor oil from an emergency towing call that had kept me out until 3 in the morning. Professor Chen, who taught Introduction to Mechanical Systems, looked around the lecture hall at our class of 30 students and mentioned that statistically, only 20 of us would make it through the program to graduation. I made a silent promise to myself that I would be one of those 20, no matter what sacrifices it required. Eddie's brother-in-law, Ray Martinez, had turned out to be a godsend wrapped in the gruff exterior of a man who had been running Phoenix Towing for 15 years. He understood the military mindset, having served in the Marines before starting his business, and he appreciated that I showed up on time, followed directions precisely, and didn't complain about working holidays or overnight shifts. The pay was significantly better than anything else I could have found that worked around my class schedule, and Ray had made it clear that there was room for advancement if I proved myself reliable. Most college kids think towing is beneath them, he told me during my first week, as we sat in his cluttered office eating gas station sandwiches at 2 in the morning. They want easy money for minimal effort. But this business teaches you about people, about problem solving under pressure, about working with your hands and your brain at the same time. You stick with me, Carter, and I'll teach you things about vehicles and customer service that'll make you a better engineer than any textbook ever could. He was right about the learning opportunities, though I hadn't expected the education to be quite so brutal. Towing cars in Phoenix meant dealing with everything from routine breakdowns on busy highways to complex accident recoveries that required understanding physics, weight distribution, and safety protocols that could mean the difference between going home safely and ending up in the hospital. It also meant dealing with people in some of the worst moments of their lives: stranded motorists, accident victims, people whose cars had been repossessed due to financial hardship. The human side of the job was often the hardest part. I learned to recognize the difference between someone who was genuinely struggling and someone who was trying to manipulate me into bending company policies. I developed scripts for explaining impound fees to people who were clearly living paycheck to paycheck, and I learned when to be firm about business rules and when a little flexibility could make the difference between someone having transportation to work the next day or losing their job entirely. One night in late September, I got called to tow a broken-down Honda Civic from outside a 24-hour diner near the university. The owner was a young woman about my age, sitting on the curb with her head in her hands, crying quietly as she talked on her phone. As I hooked up her car, I could hear fragments of her conversation, something about tuition money and her parents refusing to help and not knowing how she was going to pay for repairs. The situation hit too close to home for me to maintain my usual professional distance. When I approached her to get the paperwork signed, I found myself offering information about the emergency financial aid programs at the university, writing down Counselor Williams's name and phone number on the back of my business card. The young woman looked at me like I had just thrown her a life preserver, and I realized that my own experience with family financial betrayal had given me a kind of expertise that could help other people navigate similar crises. At the auto shop, Eddie had started giving me more complex repair jobs, recognizing that my mechanical aptitude was improving rapidly under the pressure of handling both civilian vehicles and the military equipment I worked on during National Guard weekends. I was learning to diagnose transmission problems by sound, to rebuild brake systems from scratch, and to work efficiently even when I was dead tired from pulling an all-nighter for the towing company. "You've got good hands for this work," Eddie told me one afternoon as I finished replacing the engine in a 1998 Ford pickup. "Most people your age don't have the patience for the detail work, but you treat every bolt like it matters. That's rare." The compliment meant more to me than he probably realized. For so many years, I had been praised for my reliability and responsibility in ways that felt like backhanded compliments, qualities that made me useful rather than valued. But Eddie and Ray appreciated my work ethic because it made me good at my job, not because it made me easy to exploit. My classes were challenging but manageable, mostly because the problem-solving skills I was developing at work translated directly to my engineering coursework. When Professor Chen assigned us a project involving gear ratios and mechanical advantage, I was able to draw on my experience with towing equipment to understand the practical applications in ways that my classmates who had never worked with heavy machinery couldn't quite grasp. The social aspects of college were more difficult to navigate. Most of my classmates were traditional students who lived in dorms or apartments paid for by their parents, who worried about things like which fraternity to join or whether they could afford spring break trips to Cancun. They were friendly enough, but I felt like I was speaking a different language when they complained about their parents calling too often or sending care packages with their favorite snacks. During study group sessions, I would listen to them discuss their weekend plans, parties, sporting events, casual dating scenarios that seemed impossibly carefree to someone who was scheduling her social life around 3 different work schedules and National Guard drill weekends. I didn't resent them for having easier lives, but I also couldn't relate to their concerns about whether a particular professor was too demanding or whether their meal plan covered enough premium dining options. Jessica had become not just my roommate, but my closest friend and unofficial mentor in navigating this complex new life. She understood the unique challenges of being a veteran in civilian academic settings and she had developed strategies for managing the cultural disconnect that I was struggling with. Some evenings we would sit in our small living room comparing stories from our respective transitions, laughing about the absurdity of explaining military acronyms to professors, or dealing with classmates who thought that military service was either completely heroic or completely tragic, with no understanding of the mundane reality that fell between those extremes. The thing about civilian college, Jessica told me one night as we worked on our respective homework assignments, is that most people there have never had to make truly high-stakes decisions. They don't understand that for us, academic success isn't just about personal fulfillment or career advancement. It's about proving that we can build something meaningful after everything we've been through. She was right, but she was also helping me understand that my intensity about school and work wasn't necessarily something I needed to tone down to fit in better. The discipline and focus that made me different from my classmates were also the qualities that would help me succeed in ways that went beyond just getting good grades. By October, I had settled into a routine that felt sustainable, even if it was demanding. I was earning enough from my various jobs to cover my share of rent and living expenses. My grades were solid across all my classes, and I was building relationships with professors who respected my work ethic and practical experience. Most importantly, I was sleeping soundly every night, knowing that everything I had built belonged entirely to me. It was a Tuesday evening in early November when my carefully constructed new life collided with the wreckage of my old one. I was underneath a 2003 Jeep Cherokee at Eddie's shop, wrestling with a stubborn exhaust system that had been corroded by years of Arizona road salt, when I heard the distinctive chime of my phone receiving a text message. I ignored it at first, focused on the delicate work of removing rusted bolts without damaging the surrounding components. But the chiming continued with increasing frequency until it became impossible to concentrate. When I finally slid out from under the vehicle and checked my phone, I found 17 missed calls and 23 text messages, all from numbers I had blocked months ago, but which had apparently found new ways to reach me. The messages started desperate and quickly escalated to angry, creating a timeline of escalating panic that would have been almost amusing if it hadn't been directed at me. The first message, from my mother's new phone number, was simple. "Madison, please call me. We need to talk." But as I scrolled through the subsequent messages, the tone shifted dramatically. "Your father figure is in the hospital. Derek's business loan was denied and they want collateral. The furniture store is threatening to repossess everything. We could lose the house. This is all your fault for cutting us off. You're destroying this family. How can you be so selfish when we need you most?" The final message, sent just 10 minutes before I had emerged from under the Jeep, was from Derek himself. "Your mom is crying every day because of what you've done to us. We gave you everything growing up, and this is how you repay us? We know where you work. We know where you go to school. We're coming to talk to you whether you want us to or not." I felt my hands start to shake as I read that last message. The implied threat unmistakable despite its passive-aggressive phrasing. These people had stolen my future, dismissed my pain, and justified their betrayal with casual indifference. Now that their carefully constructed house of cards was collapsing, they wanted me to rush in and prop it up again, and they were threatening to show up at my workplace and school if I didn't comply. Eddie looked up from the inventory paperwork he was reviewing at his desk in the corner of the shop. "Everything okay, Madison? You look like you've seen a ghost." I showed him the messages, watching his expression darken as he read through the escalating threats and manipulative language. Eddie had heard the full story of my family situation during the long evenings when we worked late on complex repairs, and he had made it clear that he considered my mother's actions both morally reprehensible and potentially criminal. "These people don't give up easy, do they?" he said, handing my phone back to me with obvious disgust. "You want me to be here when they show up? Because they sound like the type who'll make a scene." The offer was tempting, but I realized that Having Eddie intervene would just give my family ammunition to claim that I was turning other people against them, that I was the one being unreasonable and vindictive. This confrontation had been inevitable from the moment I walked out of their house, and it needed to happen on my terms rather than theirs. I appreciate that, Eddie, but this is something I need to handle myself. Can I leave a few minutes early today? I want to get ahead of this before they decide to show up here during business hours. Eddie nodded and waved me toward the door. Go handle your business. And Madison, don't let them guilt you into anything. What they did was theft, plain and simple, and the fact that their family doesn't make it any less criminal. The drive back to Jessica's apartment gave me time to think through my strategy for dealing with this latest crisis. I had known this moment would come eventually, the moment when their financial house of cards collapsed and they came crawling back to the daughter they had betrayed, expecting her to save them from the consequences of their own poor decisions. But I had hoped to have more time to build my defenses, to establish myself so firmly in my new life that their manipulation tactics would bounce off me harmlessly. Jessica was home when I arrived, studying at our kitchen table with textbooks, and highlighters spread around her laptop like the aftermath of an academic explosion. She took one look at my face and immediately closed her books, giving me her full attention with the same focused intensity she had once brought to analyzing battlefield intelligence. "Family drama?" she asked, cutting straight to the heart of the matter with characteristic military precision. I showed her the messages, watching her expression cycle through disbelief, anger, and protective concern. "They're planning to show up at my work or school if I don't respond to their demands for financial assistance. Derek's business loan was denied. They're facing repossession of the furniture they bought with my college fund, and somehow this is all my fault for refusing to continue funding their lifestyle." Jessica read through the messages twice, paying particular attention to Derek's thinly veiled threat about knowing where I worked and went to school. "This crosses the line from family dysfunction into harassment territory," she said finally. "You need to document everything in case this escalates to the point where you need legal intervention." She was right, but I also knew that my family's next move would be emotional manipulation rather than outright intimidation. They would show up at Eddie's shop or on campus with tears and sob stories, painting themselves as victims of their ungrateful daughter's cruelty, rather than as adults facing the consequences of their own financial irresponsibility. "What's your gut telling you about how to handle this?" Jessica asked, settling into problem-solving mode. "Do you want to try to head them off with a phone call, or let them make the first move and respond accordingly?" I thought about the various options, weighing the potential outcomes of each approach. Calling them back would give them the opportunity to launch into their practiced manipulation routine, complete with tears and guilt trips and accusations of selfishness. Ignoring them completely would likely escalate their desperation and lead to more public confrontations that could disrupt my work and school commitments. "I think I need to meet with them," I said finally. "But on my terms, in a public place where they can't create too much of a scene. I want to make it clear that their financial crisis is not my responsibility, and that any attempt to disrupt my work or education will result in legal action." Jessica nodded approvingly. "Smart. Where are you thinking?" "That coffee shop near campus, the one that's always busy with students. Public enough to keep them from getting too dramatic, familiar. Enough territory that I'll feel comfortable, and close enough to campus security that I can get help if things get out of hand." We spent the next hour planning the confrontation like a military operation, discussing potential scenarios and responses, identifying escape routes and backup plans. Jessica offered to be nearby during the meeting, ready to intervene if my family's behavior became threatening or disruptive. When I finally called my mother back, her voice was immediately filled with relief and desperation. "Madison, thank God. We've been so worried about you. We need to see you right away. This is a family emergency." "I'll meet you tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the Starbucks on University Drive," I said, cutting off her attempts to launch into an immediate explanation of their crisis. "Come alone or with Derek, but no one else. This is not a negotiation. It's me giving you the opportunity to say whatever you think you need to say. Madison, honey, we can't wait until tomorrow. This is urgent. The furniture people are coming. Thursday to repossess everything if we don't make a payment, and tomorrow at 3 p.m., I repeated firmly. Or not at all. Your choice. After I hung up, I felt the familiar calm that had always settled over me before important missions in Afghanistan. This wasn't about anger or revenge or proving a point. This was about establishing clear boundaries with people who had demonstrated that they would exploit any weakness, manipulate any kindness, and twist any generosity into an obligation to fund their poor decisions indefinitely. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether my family was capable of respecting those boundaries, or whether I would need to take more drastic steps to protect the life I had built from their continued attempts to steal from my future. The Starbucks on University Drive was crowded with the usual afternoon mix of students cramming for exams and office workers grabbing their daily caffeine fix when I arrived. 15 minutes early, I chose a table near the back corner where I could see both entrances and have a wall behind me. Old habits from deployment that still served me well in situations where I expected conflict. Jessica was stationed at a table across the room with her laptop open, pretending to work on assignments while actually keeping watch in case the meeting went sideways. My mother and Derek arrived exactly on time, which surprised me since punctuality had never been my mother's strong suit. They looked around the crowded coffee shop with obvious discomfort, clearly having expected this meeting to take place somewhere more private where they could deploy their full arsenal of emotional manipulation without an audience of college students and baristas. My mother had dressed for maximum sympathy impact, a faded sweater that I recognized from her wardrobe during our genuinely lean years, minimal makeup that emphasized the dark circles under her eyes, and an overall appearance that screamed struggling single mother rather than woman who recently spent thousands of dollars on luxury furniture. Derek, meanwhile, looked like he was dressed for a job interview, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks that were probably part of his effort to present himself as a serious businessman to the loan officers who had apparently rejected his food. Truck financing. Madison, sweetheart, my mother began before she had even fully sat down, reaching across the table to try to grasp my hands. You look so thin. Are you eating enough? I've been so worried about you living in that apartment with someone we don't even know. I kept my hands wrapped around my coffee cup, avoiding her attempted physical contact while noting how quickly she had shifted into concerned mother mode, despite months of radio silence. I'm fine, Mom. Jessica is a friend from my Army unit, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. What did you want to discuss? Derek cleared his throat importantly, apparently having rehearsed his role in this conversation. Madison, we owe you an apology. Things got a little heated the last time we talked, and we said some things we didn't mean. Your mother and I have been under a lot of stress with the wedding and trying to merge our lives together. The casual way he characterized their theft of my life savings as things getting heated was almost impressive in its audacity. I waited for him to continue, curious to see how far they would go with this revisionist version of events. The truth is, my mother jumped in, tears already welling up in her eyes. We made some mistakes with money management. Derek's business loan application didn't go through the way we expected, and now we're facing some serious financial challenges. The furniture store wants their money by Thursday, and if we can't pay them, they're going to take everything. She paused for dramatic effect, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she had clearly brought specifically for this purpose. We could lose the house, Madison. After everything we've been through, after all the years I worked to keep us afloat, we could end up homeless because of one bad financial decision. I took a sip of my coffee and studied their faces, noting the careful choreography of their presentation. My mother's tears were real enough, but they were tears of self-pity rather than genuine remorse. Derek's supportive hand on her shoulder was positioned perfectly for maximum visual impact, but his eyes kept darting around the coffee shop like he was embarrassed to be seen having this conversation in public. Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly, I said calmly. You took my college fund without permission, spent it on furniture and electronics and jewelry, and now you're facing repossession because Derek's business loan was denied. And somehow this constitutes an emergency that I'm supposed to solve. It wasn't without permission, Derek said quickly, his careful composure slipping slightly. You're part of the family, and family resources should be used for family needs. We were investing in creating a stable home environment that would benefit everyone. The absolute absurdity of describing a 75-inch television and diamond tennis bracelet as family needs almost made me laugh, but I maintained my neutral expression. And what exactly are you expecting me to do about your current financial situation? My mother leaned forward, her voice dropping to a desperate whisper. We need you to co-sign for a personal loan, just until Derek's business gets off the ground. The bank said that with your military service and steady employment, you'd be an ideal co-signer. It would only be temporary, just enough to get us through this rough patch. There it was, the real reason for this carefully staged reconciliation meeting. They didn't want forgiveness or understanding. They wanted access to my credit rating and earning potential. They had burned through my savings, and now they wanted to leverage my military service record to access even more money that they had no realistic plan for repaying. And if Derek's food truck business doesn't succeed? I asked. What happens to my credit when you default on the loan? Derek's face flushed red at the implication that his business might fail. The food truck industry is booming in Phoenix. I've done extensive market research, and there's clearly demand for gourmet hot dogs with international flair. This is a solid investment opportunity, not some get-rich-quick scheme. I had to admire his commitment to the fantasy, even in the face of loan officers who had apparently seen through his business plan. If it's such a solid opportunity, why did the bank turn down your application? They don't understand the food service industry, he said dismissively. They're looking for traditional businesses with established track records. They can't see the innovative potential of what I'm proposing. My mother jumped back into the conversation, sensing that Derek's defensiveness wasn't helping their cause. Madison, I know we hurt you. I know taking that money was wrong, but we're family, and family forgives each other. We raised you, we supported you through everything, and now we need your support in return. The manipulation was so textbook that I almost felt sorry for how transparent it was. She was cycling through guilt, obligation, and family loyalty with the desperation of someone playing their last cards in a losing hand. You raised me to be independent and responsible, I said quietly. You taught me that actions have consequences and that adults have to solve their own problems. You also taught me to work hard for what I want and to save money for emergencies. I learned those lessons well. Madison, my mother started, but I held up my hand to stop her. I'm not co-signing for any loans. I'm not giving you money. I'm not bailing you out of the consequences of your own financial decisions. You made the choice to spend my college fund on luxury items instead of asking me first. You made the choice to take on debt you couldn't afford. You made the choice to invest in Derek's business dreams without having a backup plan. Derek's face was now completely red, and he was struggling to maintain his reasonable businessman facade. You're really going to let your own mother lose her house over money? What kind of daughter does that? The kind of daughter who learned that enabling other people's poor decisions doesn't actually help them, I replied calmly. The kind of daughter who refuses to set herself on fire to keep other people warm. My mother was crying openly now, but there was an edge of anger creeping into her voice. After everything we've done for you, after all the sacrifices we made, this is how you repay us? By abandoning us when we need you most? Mom, I said gently, you didn't sacrifice for me. You sacrificed me. There's a difference. The truth of that statement hung in the air between us like smoke from an explosion, and for a moment, none of us spoke. Around us, the normal life of the coffee shop continued. Students typing papers, friends catching up over lattes, baristas calling out complicated drink orders. But at our table, 24 years of family dysfunction had finally been distilled down to its essential truth. I wasn't their daughter. I was their retirement plan, and now that I had removed myself from their portfolio, they were panicking about their financial future. The silence that followed my words stretched until it became uncomfortable, but I didn't rush to fill it. I had learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a confrontation was simply letting the other person sit with the truth until they were forced to respond to it. My mother's tears had stopped flowing as she processed what I had said, and I could see her cycling through different emotional strategies, like a computer running through possible responses to an unexpected input. Derek was the first to break, his carefully constructed, reasonable businessman persona cracking completely. "You know what? I told your mother this was a waste of time. You've always been selfish, Madison. Even when you were a kid, everything had to be about you and your plans and your precious college dreams. Some people understand family loyalty, and some people only care about themselves." His voice was getting louder, drawing glances from nearby tables, but he seemed beyond caring about public appearances now. "Your mother worked her ass off to raise you by herself, and the first time she finds happiness with someone who actually wants to build a life with her, you throw a tantrum and cut her off completely. That's not independence. That's cruelty." I felt a flicker of the old guilt trying to take hold, the familiar voice that had whispered for years that maybe I was being too harsh, too demanding, too unwilling to just go along with whatever my family needed from me. But then I looked at Derek's red face and entitled anger, and I remembered that this man had moved into my house and spent my savings without a moment's hesitation or gratitude. "Derek," I said calmly, "you've known my mother for less than a year. You have no idea what my childhood was like or what sacrifices were actually made. What you do know is that there was money available when you needed it, and now there isn't. That's really what this is about." My mother found her voice again, though it came out smaller than her usual dramatic declarations. "Madison, that's not fair. Derek loves me, and I love him. This isn't just about money." "Then prove it," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms. "Solve your financial problems without involving me. Get Derek a job to supplement his food truck preparations. Downsize to an apartment you can actually afford. Return the furniture and electronics you bought with my college fund and use that money to pay your debts. Show me that this relationship can survive without external funding." Derek's laugh was bitter and incredulous. "You want me to get some minimum wage job like I'm a teenager? I'm a 48-year-old man with a business plan and years of experience in customer service. I'm not going to stock shelves at Walmart just because you're too selfish to help your own family." "What's selfish about expecting adults to pay their own bills?" I asked genuinely. "What's selfish about refusing to co-sign for debt that you have no realistic plan for repaying? What's selfish about protecting my own financial future after my family stole from me once already?" My mother tried a different approach, her voice taking on the wounded tone that had always been effective at making me feel guilty as a child. "Madison, I never stole from you. That money was in a family account, and I used it for family needs. Maybe I should have asked first, but I didn't think my own daughter would begrudge me a chance at happiness after all the years I spent alone." The rewriting of history was breathtaking in its audacity. "Mom, you spent my deployment savings on a tennis bracelet and a 75-inch television. Those weren't family needs. They were luxury purchases for your new husband. And you didn't just forget to ask me. You deliberately waited until I was at drill weekend to make the withdrawals because you knew I would have said no." "Everything I did was for this family," she insisted, her voice rising slightly. "The furniture was to make Derek feel welcome in our home. The television was so we could spend quality time together as a family. The bracelet was an anniversary gift that represented our commitment to building a life together. How is any of that selfish?" I stared at her. marveling at her ability to reframe luxury spending as family investments. "Mom, when have Derek and I ever spent quality time watching television together? When has he ever made any effort to include me in this new family you're supposedly building?" He moved into the house and immediately started treating me like an unwelcome guest who happened to pay rent. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his seat, apparently realizing that his treatment of me hadn't exactly supported their narrative about building a loving blended family. "I tried to connect with you, Madison, but you were always working or studying, or off doing your military stuff. You never made an effort to get to know me as a person. I was working 3 jobs to save money for college while you were planning how to spend my savings," I replied evenly. "And when I did try to talk to you, you made it clear that you thought I was too serious, too focused on school, too military, for your taste. You wanted a stepdaughter who would be grateful for your presence and happy to fund your lifestyle, not one who had her own goals and expectations." My mother looked back and forth between Derek and me like she was watching a tennis match, clearly recognizing that the dynamic between us was more hostile than she had admitted to herself. "You're both important to me," she said weakly. "I don't want to choose between my daughter and my husband." "You already chose," I said quietly. "You chose when you spent my college fund without asking. You chose when you dismissed my concerns as drama. You chose when you told me that Derek deserved my savings more than I deserved an education. I'm not asking you to choose now. I'm just refusing to pretend that you didn't already make your choice months ago." The truth of that statement hit my mother like a physical blow, and I could see her face crumple as she realized that there was no way to undo the decision she had made. She had gambled that I would eventually forgive her and continue to serve as the family's financial safety net, but that gamble had failed. Derek, meanwhile, was regrouping for another attempt at manipulation. "Look, Madison, I get that you're angry. You have every right to be upset about the money situation. But holding grudges doesn't help anyone. Your mother is miserable without you in her life, and I can see that this estrangement is hurting you too. Why don't we work out a payment plan, where we gradually pay back what we borrowed from your college fund, and you help us get through this immediate crisis with the furniture store?" The suggestion was almost reasonable enough to be tempting, which made it more dangerous than Derek's previous emotional manipulation attempts. A payment plan implied that they were taking responsibility for their actions while still getting what they wanted in the immediate term. "How much would you pay back each month?" I asked, genuinely curious about whether Derek had thought this through at all. He looked at my mother, clearly hoping she would field this question, but she was still processing the emotional impact of our conversation. "Well, that would depend on how quickly the food truck business takes off," he said finally. "Maybe $50 or $100 a month to start, with larger payments once I'm generating steady income." I did the math quickly in my head. At $50 a month, it would take over 11 years for them to repay what they had stolen, assuming they never missed a payment. At $100 a month, it would still take nearly 6 years. And that was assuming Derek's food truck dreams materialized into actual income, which seemed increasingly unlikely given that he couldn't even secure initial financing. "Derek," I said gently, "at $50 a month, you'd be paying me back until I'm 35 years old, and that's assuming your business succeeds and you never miss a payment. Do you really think that's a reasonable proposal?" His face flushed again as he realized how transparent his bad faith offer had been. "Every small business takes time to turn a profit. You can't expect immediate returns on any investment." "It wasn't an investment," I said firmly. "It was theft. And I'm not a business partner in your food truck venture. I'm the victim of your family's financial abuse. I don't owe you patience or flexibility or continued support while you figure out how to be a functional adult." The conversation had reached its natural conclusion, and I could see that neither my mother nor Derek was prepared to accept the reality that I was no longer available to fund their poor decisions. They had come here expecting to deploy guilt and manipulation to restore their access to my earning potential. But instead, they had been forced to confront the fact that their actions had permanently damaged our relationship. I stood up from the table, leaving my half-finished coffee behind. This conversation is over. I wish you both well, but I won't be funding your lifestyle or co-signing for your debts. You're adults. Figure it out. My mother made one last desperate attempt, grabbing my wrist as I turned to leave. Madison, please, I'm begging you, we'll lose everything. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm. Mom, you already lost everything when you chose Derek's comfort over your daughter's future. I hope someday you realize what that choice actually cost you. As I walked toward the exit, Derek called out loud enough for the entire coffee shop to hear. You'll regret this, Madison. Family is all you have in this world. I paused at the door and turned back one final time. You're right, Derek. Family is everything. That's why I'm building one that actually values me. 3 months later, I received a letter forwarded from my mother's address, the scholarship notification I had been waiting for. The Sarah Morrison Scholarship for Female Veterans had come through, covering not just my remaining tuition, but providing a generous living stipend. As I read the acceptance letter, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Derek left. Furniture was repossessed. I was wrong about everything. Can we talk? I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some bridges, once burned, were never meant to be rebuilt. I had found my real family. Jessica, Eddie, Ray, Professor Chen, Counselor Williams, and all the other people who valued my work ethic and ambition rather than exploiting it. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't getting revenge on the people who wronged you. Sometimes it's building such an amazing life that their absence becomes a blessing. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about overcoming family toxicity and building the life you deserve.